Butch Cassidy is one of the most legendary outlaws of the Old West, known for his daring train robberies, quick wit, and the infamous Wild Bunch Gang. But what if the legendary bandit once considered laying down his guns and surrendering? It may sound unbelievable, but history holds some surprising twists. Did Butch Cassidy really try to strike a deal to escape the life of an outlaw? Stick around as we dive into this lesser-known chapter of Cassidy's life, separating fact from fiction. If you enjoy exploring stories of the Old West, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and stay tuned for more wild stories from history. Worn down by a life on the run, Butch Cassidy explored several possibilities before ultimately deciding that leaving the country was his best option. Instead of continuing his outlaw ways, he, along with the Sundance Kid and Etta Place, sought a fresh start in Argentina in the early 1900s. But before making that dramatic move, did Cassidy actually consider turning himself in and seeking amnesty? The historical record suggests he may have. Another claim goes even further. Some say Cassidy attempted to strike a deal with the Union Pacific Railroad, offering to abandon his train-robbing career in exchange for legitimate employment as an express guard. However, the reliability of that particular story is questionable. There are two slightly different versions of Cassidy's supposed surrender attempt. One account comes from Charles Kelly's The Outlaw Trail, a history of Butch Cassidy and his Wild Bunch, first published in 1938 and later revised in 1959. According to Kelly, in the autumn of 1899, a well-dressed, stocky man entered the office of Orlando W. Powers, a well-known attorney in Salt Lake City. Seeking discretion, the visitor asked if their conversation would remain strictly confidential. After receiving reassurance, he revealed his identity. "My name is George Leroy Parker, better known as Butch Cassidy." He then explained that he was ready to leave his life as an outlaw behind. Cassidy pointed to the grim fate of several Wild Bunch members who had been killed or captured in recent years. He recognized that it was only a matter of time before he met the same end. "Sooner or later, it'll be my turn," he reportedly told Powers. The infamous outlaw had come to the conclusion that it was time to walk away, before it was too late. While this story is compelling, historians continue to debate its authenticity. Some believe it aligns with Cassidy's well-documented reputation as a charismatic, intelligent outlaw who preferred strategy over violence. Others argue that the lack of concrete evidence makes it difficult to determine whether this meeting ever took place. Regardless of whether Cassidy truly attempted to negotiate his surrender, his eventual escape to South America suggests that he knew his days in the West were numbered. The idea of Butch Cassidy trying to go straight adds yet another fascinating layer to his already legendary story. It's no surprise that Butch Cassidy was looking for a way out. He wasn't a typical outlaw by any stretch. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he didn't fit the image of a hardened criminal. In fact, his personality closely resembled the charismatic, quick-witted character played by Paul Newman in the 1969 film Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. For once, Hollywood may have captured the essence of a real historical figure. Butch was known for his humor, charm, and even moments of self-deprecation, qualities that seemed unusual for a fugitive at the turn of the century. He wasn't the kind of outlaw who thrived in isolation or enjoyed living in the shadows. He valued friendships and often surrounded himself with respectable, law-abiding people. Despite being wanted by authorities, he spent long stretches of time in small communities where he was well-liked. He formed strong connections in places like Dubois, Dunlander, and Star Valley in Wyoming, as well as Browns Park in Colorado. Later, after fleeing the United States, he built a life in Cholula, Argentina, where he once again integrated into the local community. Before walking into Orlando Powers' office in 1899, Butch and the lawman had never met in person. However, they had a previous business connection. In 1896, Butch's close friend Matt Warner, along with two others, Dave Wall and E.B. Coleman, was arrested for the murder of two men in a dispute over a mining claim near Vernal, Utah. Warner and Wall lacked the funds for legal representation, so Butch arranged for their defense through his Wyoming attorney, Douglas Preston. He secured the services of Powers and his partner, D.N. Stroup. The source of the legal fees remains debated. One version of the story suggests Butch financed the defense by robbing a bank in Montpelier, Idaho. However, Powers later denied this claim, insisting he was paid by relatives of E.B. Coleman. During their meeting, Powers listened as Butch Cassidy made his case. The outlaw argued that he wasn't as bad as his reputation suggested. He claimed he had never taken a life and that his crimes had been directed solely at banks and railroads, never individuals. When Butch finished speaking, Powers looked at him and simply asked, "What do you want me to do?" Butch Cassidy got straight to the point. "Here's the thing," he said. "You're the best lawman in Utah. You know the right people and how things work. I was hoping you could speak with the governor and work out some kind of pardon so I could settle down without being pursued. If I promise to leave that life behind, could something be arranged? You have my word on it." According to historian Charles Kelly, the lawyer's response was not optimistic. Powers acknowledged that he sympathized with Butch's situation, but there were legal complications. The governor of Utah, Heber M. Wells, only had the authority to pardon crimes committed within the state. Since Butch had not been convicted of any offenses in Utah, there was no official record to clear. While he was suspected of robbing the Pleasant Valley Coal Company payroll in Castlegate in 1897, he had never stood trial for it. If he admitted guilt or was convicted, then a pardon could apply, but only within Utah. It would not prevent legal action for crimes in other states. Powers was direct in his advice. "No, Cassidy," he said. "I'm afraid it's too late to turn back, at least if you want to stay in the West. My best advice is to leave the country and start over somewhere new, where no one knows your past." Butch took the lawman's words seriously. He thanked him for his honesty, but expressed his disappointment. "I suppose you're right. You know the law better than I do, but it's a hard thing, always being on the move, never knowing if you'll be left in peace." Another version of this conversation appears in A.F.C. Green's Butch Cassidy in Fremont County, a monograph written around 1940 and later included in the Butch Cassidy collection by Jim Delente in 1986. This account, like Kelly's, places the meeting in Powers' Salt Lake City office, but provides a more vivid description of Cassidy's appearance. According to Green, the lawman's stenographer ushered in a man who appeared to be in his 40s. His face, weathered from years spent outdoors, showed signs of a rough life. Once blonde hair had begun to turn gray. His clothing was simple, overalls and a blue denim jumper, giving him the look of a man more accustomed to the open range than a lawman's office. According to historical data, the conversation between Butch Cassidy and attorney Orlando Powers unfolded like this. Cassidy began cautiously. "Is what I say to you to go as a client consulting his lawman from now on?" Powers reassured him. "You mean a confidential discussion?" "That's right," Cassidy confirmed. "Then yes, anything you say stays between us." With that assurance, Cassidy revealed his identity. "I'm Butch Cassidy." Powers remained composed. "What can I do for you?" Cassidy explained his predicament. "There are a lot of charges against me and plenty of reward money on my head. I'm tired of constantly being on the move, never able to settle in one place. But here's the thing, I've kept track of everything, and I know there's no one left who could take the stand and identify me for any crime. Those who could have testified are either gone or have passed away. So I've been wondering, why not turn myself in and stand trial for one of those old charges?" Powers, however, was skeptical. "It wouldn't work. You've taken money from too many powerful corporations. Even if no known witness could identify you, those companies wouldn't take any chances. If you went to trial, you can be sure they'd find someone willing to testify against you. I'm afraid your only option is to stay on the move." Despite minor variations, this account aligns closely with the version recorded by Charles Kelly. Both historians captured the same general exchange, and had they paraphrased instead of quoting directly, the slight differences might have gone unnoticed. The most notable discrepancy is how Butch was dressed. Kelly described him as well-dressed, implying city attire, while Green painted a different picture, portraying him in overalls and a blue denim jumper, as if he had just arrived from the trail. While this detail may seem small, it does spark curiosity about how Cassidy presented himself at that moment. There is another issue in Kelly's account that raises questions. He claimed that Butch Cassidy introduced himself to Powers as George Leroy Parker. However, historical records, including those from Cassidy's family and church documents, confirm that his real name was Robert Leroy Parker. It is true that during his time as an outlaw, Butch occasionally used the alias George Cassidy. Additionally, throughout his book, Charles Kelly consistently referred to him as George. But if Butch was being honest with Powers and sincerely seeking his help, wouldn't he have used his real name? This detail, while seemingly small, becomes more significant because Kelly presented his version as a direct, word-for-word account of the conversation. Due in part to this inconsistency, I chose to rely on Green's version over Kelly's in my book on Cassidy, relegating Kelly's account to an endnote. Another reason I favored Green's version is that he was a contemporary of Cassidy and may have even known him personally. Some have speculated that Green had a family connection to the John Simpson family, who were close friends and neighbors of Butch during his ranching years near Dubois, Wyoming. Despite these being minor discrepancies, I couldn't ignore them. Wanting to clarify the origins of both accounts, I decided to investigate further. A tip from Wild Bunch historians Dan Buck and Ann Meadows quickly led me to the source of Green's version. It turned out that he had taken it directly from Frederick R. Bechtolt's 1924 book, Tales of the Old Timers, a source I had initially overlooked when researching my Cassidy biography. At the time, I knew of Bechtolt's book, but never tracked it down because it had been out of print for years. After a brief search, I abandoned the effort, assuming it was just another sensationalized Old West story from the 1920s. Bechtold, after all, was primarily a novelist and short story writer, and his work had even been adapted into early Hollywood westerns. Given that background, I didn't expect his book to contain reliable historical information. However, discovering this connection between Bechtolt's work and Green's account added a new layer of complexity to the story. I initially underestimated Bechtold, assuming he focused solely on storytelling rather than serious historical research. However, he did produce some credible accounts of frontier history. If his book, Tales of the Old Timers, was the first published source to mention Butch Cassidy's alleged offer to surrender, then the question remains, where did Bechtold get his information? His book primarily covered figures from the southwestern frontier, dedicating only a single chapter to Butch Cassidy. Like Charles Kelly and AFC Green, Bechtold did not include footnotes or detailed citations. However, he did provide a brief acknowledgement section. Among those he credited with connections to Cassidy were W.A. Richards, who served as Wyoming's governor during part of Butch's outlaw years, Will Simpson, the prosecutor in Butch's 1894 trial, and James Simpson, Will Simpson's son. While Governor Richards and Will Simpson may have had knowledge of Cassidy's activities, neither of them was present during the alleged meeting with Powers. They were also not directly involved in that particular event. So could Bechtold himself have been a reliable source? Born in Pennsylvania in 1874, Frederick Ritchie Bechtold grew up in the West and attended both the University of North Dakota and the University of Washington. After graduating in 1896, he began working as a reporter for the Seattle Star. Over the next decade, he wrote for major newspapers in Oakland, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Salt Lake City. Experienced journalists have a way of uncovering information, and Bechtold's time in Salt Lake City might have placed him in close proximity to individuals familiar with Cassidy's story. If he was in the area around the time of the alleged Cassidy-Powers meeting, or even shortly afterward, he may have had access to first-hand details. Perhaps he even obtained a stenographer's record of the conversation. While attorneys are bound by confidentiality, law offices, especially when handling high-profile clients, have often been known to leak information. The same was likely true in the Old West. Bechtold's location and career lend some credibility to his account. But what about Charles Kelly's version? Though Kelly was not present at the time of the Cassidy-Powers meeting, he did spend many years in Salt Lake City. After his military discharge in 1919, he married and settled there. However, his primary focus at the time was music. He played both the violin and cornet. It wasn't until nearly a decade later that he began writing, and another 20 years would pass before he published The Outlaw Trail. It is entirely possible that Charles Kelly simply reworked Bechtold's version of events. In the second edition of The Outlaw Trail, Kelly acknowledged that he had access to Bechtold's book when writing the first edition. In fact, in 1939, 1 year after publishing the first edition, Kelly admitted in a letter to Will Simpson, the prosecutor in Butch Cassidy's trial, that Bechtold was one of his primary sources. If Kelly relied heavily on Bechtold, Why did his version differ? He had no issue with directly quoting earlier writers, including Bechtold, as he openly admitted in his letter to Simpson. However, he may have already incorporated substantial portions of Bechtold's research on other aspects of Cassidy's life. Perhaps he felt the conversation between Cassidy and Powers warranted his own interpretation, rather than another direct repetition. Regardless, when Cassidy left Powers' office in 1899, he was undoubtedly disappointed, but he was not ready to abandon his efforts. He knew of another influential figure in Salt Lake City, someone who might be more willing to support his plea for a pardon. More importantly, this individual had even closer ties to Utah Governor Heber Wells than attorney Orlando Powers did. That man was Parley P. Christensen. Kelly described Christensen as a former sheriff of Juab County, Utah, and someone who had known Butch Cassidy in his younger years. However, official records from Juab County do not support this claim. Local officials found no evidence that Christensen ever served as county sheriff. They did find records of a Parley P. Christensen, who was appointed town marshal of Nephi, the county seat, but that appointment did not occur until 1914, long after Cassidy's meeting with Powers. Further investigations suggested that the Parley P. Christensen Cassidy sought out in 1899 was not a lawman at the time, but like Powers, a well-established attorney in Salt Lake City. A graduate of the University of Desiree, later the University of Utah, in Cornell University's law school, Christensen was an emerging leader in Republican politics. He was well connected within Utah's government, having served as secretary of the 1895 Utah State Constitutional Convention. During that same period, he was elected to the state legislature and later became Salt Lake County attorney. Christensen was once seen as a strong contender for the governorship. However, he eventually broke with the Republican Party and aligned himself with the progressive movement. In 1920, he ran for president of the United States as the nominee of the Farmer Labor Party. Parley Christensen proved to be much more optimistic than Orlando Powers about Butch Cassidy's chances for clemency. He acted quickly, securing an appointment for Cassidy with Utah Governor Heber Wells. According to Charles Kelly, Wells listened to Cassidy's proposal and initially seemed open to the idea. He reportedly told Cassidy that if there were no outstanding murder warrants against him, some form of leniency might be possible. However, when the governor asked the attorney general to check Cassidy's record, a warrant for murder surfaced. During their second meeting, Wells informed Cassidy that, unfortunately, his hands were tied. Cassidy insisted he had never taken a life, but that was not the determining factor. The governor had made it clear there could be no murder charges against him. Since a warrant had been found, the deal was off the table. Given his history, Cassidy may not have been entirely surprised by this outcome. Over the past few years, his name had become almost synonymous with high-profile train and bank robberies throughout the West. Whenever a financial institution was targeted in Utah or nearby states, Cassidy and the Wild Bunch were among the prime suspects. If a guard had lost his life during one of those incidents, it was almost inevitable that Cassidy's name would be connected to a warrant. At this point, attorney Orlando Powers re-entered the picture with a unique proposition. What if Cassidy not only agreed to abandon his criminal ways, but also accepted a legitimate job working for the Union Pacific Railroad as an express guard? If he did, there was a possibility that the railroad might withdraw its charges against him. The plan had some logic behind it. As a railroad employee, Cassidy's movements would be largely accounted for, reducing the likelihood of further suspicions. Additionally, Powers reasoned that other outlaws might think twice before targeting Union Pacific trains if they knew Butch Cassidy himself was protecting them. This idea is absent from AFC Green's account of Cassidy's life. However, it does appear in Butch Cassidy, My Brother, a book by Lula Parker Bettinson, Cassidy's younger sister. Yet Kelly was likely Bettinson's primary source. Frederick Bechtold also references a version of this story. According to Bechtold, Cassidy arranged a meeting with John Ward, the sheriff of Uinta County, Wyoming, at a mountain pass along the Denver and Rio Grande line. There, Cassidy reportedly assured Ward that the railroads could stand down their armed guards because there would be no further trouble. However, Bechtold makes no mention of Cassidy requesting any kind of formal agreement in return. Even if Cassidy had considered Powers' idea, it would have offered him little real protection. At best, Union Pacific officials could clear him of crimes committed against their company. but Cassidy was wanted by multiple states, including Wyoming and Utah. He was also suspected of robberies in Colorado, Idaho, Nevada, Montana, and New Mexico. Union Pacific had no authority to offer him immunity from state or federal charges. However, one piece of historical evidence suggests Cassidy may have been open to the idea of working for the railroad. A letter found in the Utah State Archives, part of Governor Wells' correspondence collection, adds credibility to the theory. Dated May 30th, 1900, the letter was written by W.S. Seavey, a general agent for the Denver office of the Thiel Detective Service. In it, Seavey informed Governor Wells that, based on reliable information, Cassidy was willing to surrender, take a job as a railroad guard, and commit to living as a law-abiding citizen if the authorities would agree to leave him alone. The credibility of the letter gains weight due to the background of W.S. Seavey. He was not just an occasional investigator, but a seasoned law enforcement officer. Before becoming a general agent for the Thiel Detective Service, Seavey had spent 8 years leading the Omaha Police Department. If he deemed his information trustworthy, there was a strong chance it was. While his spelling may have been questionable, his experience in law enforcement was not. According to Kelly, attorney Orlando Powers formally presented the idea to the Union Pacific Railroad. After some deliberation, the railroad officials found the proposal interesting enough to pursue. They authorized Powers to reach out to Butch Cassidy, hoping to negotiate terms. Powers then contacted Douglas Preston, Cassidy's attorney since the early 1890s, requesting that he deliver the offer. Preston agreed and arranged a meeting with Cassidy at Lost Soldier Pass in southwestern Wyoming. The plan was for Cassidy to meet Union Pacific's chief detective and company officials who had the authority to make a deal. However, the meeting never took place. Kelly recounts that Cassidy arrived at the designated location, but neither Preston nor the railroad representatives appeared. After waiting for hours, Cassidy eventually left, disappointed. Later, Preston explained that an unexpected storm delayed his group. When they finally reached the site and found Cassidy gone, he expressed his frustration by kicking a stone near a lone cedar tree where the meeting was supposed to happen. Underneath, he discovered a note left by Cassidy, expressing his frustration over the failed meeting and signaling his loss of faith in the negotiation process. There are reasons to believe Cassidy was genuinely considering a legal way out of his life on the run. Unlike many outlaws of the era, he did not seem opposed to honest labor. While he committed his first bank robbery in 1889, there is little evidence linking him to any other major crimes for the next 7 years. His involvement in the 1896 Montpelier, Idaho, bank robbery appears to have been motivated by a desire to help his friend, Matt Warner. During that period, he likely engaged in small-scale cattle theft, a practice not uncommon among Wyoming cowboys of the early 1890s. Although taking horses was viewed more seriously, leading to his 18-month prison sentence, Cassidy's overall criminal record during those years was relatively quiet compared to other outlaws. From the mid to late 1890s, Cassidy's reputation as a leader of the Wild Bunch grew, but by the fall of 1899, he was once again working an honest job. He had spent the previous year as an assistant foreman and trail boss at an English-owned ranch in the New Mexico Territory, using the alias Jim Lowe. The job was demanding and often monotonous, requiring him to manage herds under difficult conditions. Yet he seemed to enjoy it. When the foreman position became available, Cassidy expressed interest in taking it. However, with Pinkerton detectives actively searching for him, he felt it was best to move on. Years later, the ranch owner, William French, spoke highly of Cassidy, recalling him as a responsible and capable employee. Based on his work history, it is plausible that Cassidy could have transitioned into a role as an express guard for the Union Pacific. However, the likelihood of the railroad actually hiring him remains uncertain. While the concept of an outlaw becoming a railroad protector may seem unusual, it was not entirely unheard of. Glenn Larson, a Hollywood producer known for the 1970s television series Alias Smith and Jones, claimed to have drawn inspiration for his show from a similar historical arrangement mentioned in Pinkerton agency records. Additionally, Butch's sister, Lula Parker Bettinson, and her co-author, Dora Flack, insisted that while the idea seemed improbable, it was indeed a plan that law enforcement officials at the time seriously considered. From the perspective of the Union Pacific Railroad, Such an arrangement would have likely been unthinkable. The company's board of directors had invested a staggering $110 million to acquire the railroad in 1893, handing over the responsibility of protecting valuable shipments, including gold bullion, coins, and paper currency, to a known outlaw would have been a difficult decision to justify. Their primary concern would have been security, and placing Cassidy in such a role could have been perceived as a major risk. Furthermore, E.H. Harriman, the president and a significant shareholder in the Union Pacific, was known for his practical approach to solving problems. He did not favor making deals with outlaws, but instead focused on direct action to address crime. In response to a series of train robberies the previous year, Harriman had implemented a strategy of positioning modified baggage cars, known as posse cars, at key points along the rail line. These cars contained skilled railroad detectives and former lawmen, along with fast horses ready for pursuit. The system had proven effective in discouraging and responding to robberies. Additionally, W.H. Park, the railroad's general superintendent, did not see Cassidy as the primary threat among the outlaws of the time. Instead, he and Harriman considered Harvey Logan, better known as Kid Curry, to be the Wild Bunch's most dangerous member. If the railroad had seriously entertained the idea of hiring Cassidy as an express guard, they might have questioned how effective he would be if Logan and his gang attempted a robbery. There was also the logistical challenge of ensuring Cassidy's trustworthiness. If he had access to information about shipment schedules and security procedures, it would have been necessary to monitor him closely. However, maintaining constant surveillance on a man like Cassidy would have been nearly impossible. The story of Cassidy's failed meeting with railroad representatives also becomes less credible in light of new evidence. The infamous note he allegedly left at Lost Soldier Pass, containing his frustrated message to lawyer Douglas Preston, may not have been authentic. While Charles Kelly included the note's contents in his book, it was long believed that the original document had been lost. Then, in the 1980s, copies of the note suddenly began appearing among rare document collectors, raising suspicion. Author Dan Buck later investigated the origins of the note and found a possible link to Mark Hoffman, a known forger of historical documents. Hoffman had gained notoriety for fabricating Mormon-related texts, and it appeared that he, or someone else, may have crafted the note to fit Kelly's version of events. Although Buck was unable to prove definitively that Hoffman created the forgery, he expressed strong doubts about the note's authenticity and, by extension, the entire story of the supposed meeting. In an article published in the spring 2002 issue of the Journal of the Western Outlaw Lawman History Association, Buck outlined several inconsistencies in the narrative, casting further doubt on the tale's accuracy. Douglas Preston was a longtime friend of Butch Cassidy and had also served as his defense attorney. If he had missed a scheduled meeting, especially one set in such a remote location, would Cassidy have immediately assumed betrayal? According to accounts, Preston and his group were delayed by a storm. If that were the case, wouldn't Cassidy have faced the same weather conditions? Another detail that raises questions is the note itself. It was written in ink, which suggests the need for a pen and an ink bottle. Would Cassidy have carried such supplies in his saddlebags while traveling through rugged terrain? Furthermore, the handwriting was precise and deliberate, not hurried or hastily scrawled. A message dashed off in frustration might have been written against a saddle or another uneven surface, yet this note appeared to have been written with care, as if on a desk. The circumstances surrounding the note's discovery also seem oddly convenient. Cassidy was said to have placed it under a rock, which Preston later kicked in frustration upon realizing Cassidy had left. The exact placement of the note, combined with the dramatic way it was supposedly found, raises doubts about whether the event unfolded as described. Despite these inconsistencies, Charles Kelly's account of Cassidy's failed agreement with Union Pacific officials should not be dismissed outright. In the Outlaw Trail, Kelly worked with the information available to him at the time, even if some details were unreliable. His work, while imperfect, became a foundational reference for later historians studying Butch Cassidy and the Wild Bunch. To his credit, Kelly acknowledged the limitations of his sources. In the first edition of his book, he admitted that some of the details were uncertain or contradictory. He even invited readers to share additional facts that could help correct errors in future editions. Dan Buck and Ann Meadows, in their introduction to the 1996 University of Nebraska Press reprint of the Outlaw Trail, captured the difficulty Kelly faced in piecing together Cassidy's story. They reference John Jorschke, former editor of Western Publications, who addressed a gathering of outlaw history enthusiasts in 1994. Jorschke cautioned that writing a historically accurate account is like mining for precious metal. One must sift through layers of myths, exaggerations, and missing pieces to uncover the truth. Butch Cassidy's rumored surrender offer remains one of the most intriguing what-if moments in Old West history. Whether he was truly ready to trade his outlaw life for an honest living, or if the whole story was just another Wild West legend, we may never know for certain. But one thing is clear: Cassidy was more than just a bandit. He was a man who understood survival, strategy, and reinvention. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you love diving into the mysteries and legends of the Old West, don't forget to subscribe for more stories from the frontier.